I have no conflicts of interest to disclose, and my views do not represent those of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, of which I am a director at large. So Janice has explained some of the science of implicit bias, and I would like to pull in some other factors that contribute to our implicit biases and the persistence of bias, explicit and implicit, as well as racism in our society, all of which harm children. Consider your gut reaction to the word race. What have you learned about race since you were a child, adolescent, adult, in the last year, the last week? Can you identify any assumptions about race that you have held that have changed over time, that have remained the same? Robin Kelley says that race was never just a matter of how you look, it's about how people assign meaning to how you look. There is no genetic basis for race. We humans are 99.9% identical genetically. There's actually more variation within than between the races. Because certain diseases occur at higher frequencies, in some populations they have become linked to an idea of race, even when the disease does not result from a common ancestry. One such example is sickle cell, that was an evolutionary response to malaria. Race is a historically recent idea. The Greeks did not divide people according to physical differences, but rather according to religion, status, language. The English word for race first appeared in the first 1500s and referred to a line of kings. The practice of enslaving other humans predated the idea of race. So race then is a social construct. The idea of race served to justify why some people could be denied the rights and freedoms that others could take for granted. The race distinction sought to justify social inequities as natural. It has been written and said that the definitions of race tended to exclude from humanity anyone who stood in the way of American expansion. Racism has been defined as the beliefs, attitudes, and actions resulting from categorizing individuals and groups based on a phenotype, heritage, or culture. Institutional racism describes how institutional structures and processes organize and promote racial inequity. This is embedded in the United States. The role of law and medicine were essential to the introduction and the persistence of race. Medicine and science were used to explain that there were actually differences beyond a phenotype. The law, from our Constitution to Supreme Court case law, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, all persisted in making a difference or the case for a race difference. Federal housing legislation tied to mortgage eligibility was linked to race. So from 1934 to 1962, $120 billion of home loans backed by the US government was afforded to 98% of the recipients were whites. Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, has made a great argument that incarceration rates are a reflection of institutional racism, in that drug use between whites and blacks are similar, if not more in whites, and yet blacks are incarcerated at an extraordinarily higher rate. The principles and ideals of equality and freedom conflicted with the practice of enslaving other humans. So owning human beings was the economic engine that drove an ever-expanding prosperity unprecedented in the history of the world. And yet Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy but cannot disjoin them." Historian Paul Finkelman writes, "The founding generation failed to place the nation on a road to liberty for all," and that the most responsible for this failure was Thomas Jefferson. So myth tends to distort the reality about the contradiction between our country's stated founding principles and its actual practice. They were profoundly hypocritical. Despite his rhetoric, Jefferson always was deeply committed to enslaving other humans. He owned 200 human beings. Contrary to stories, he only freed 5 of them at his death, and one was not Sally Hemings. He opposed the private manumission and public emancipation. He supported humane criminal codes for whites, but advocated harsh, barbaric punishment for slaves and free blacks. It's interesting to note that he did not earn or work for his wealth. He commodified other humans and took their earnings as his own, and history pays him homage for doing so. Consider that for 20 generations, whites have inherited socioeconomic resources from ancestors who benefited unjustly through legal institutions of slavery, segregation, and other race-related oppression. John Powell, now at Berkeley, writes, "The slick thing about whiteness is that you can reap the benefits of a racist society without personally doing anything and without personally being a racist." Peggy McIntosh writes, "I was taught to see racism as only individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group." So Derald Sue and his colleagues in 2007 wrote an article on racial microaggressions. What are they? They're brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to people of color because they belong to a racial minority group. Here's an example. I don't know if you can read. In the upper left-hand corner, the first woman says, "When I lived in New York, I had a scholarship to a private college." The other woman on the right says, "Oh, so you played sports?" The woman on the left says, "No." All right, this is skipping ahead. All right. Forms of microaggressions are micro-assault, which is an explicit racial derogation, a micro-insult, which is insensitive, demeaning a person's racial or ethnic identity, and it's often unknown to the perpetrator. A micro-invalidation is communication that excludes or negates psychological thoughts, feelings, or the experiential reality of persons of color. So we'll go through a few examples. I'm going to try and control this quickness. It must be telling me I need to talk faster. Okay, so one, Sue calls being an alien in your own land. So that's where you're asked, where are you from? You speak good English. What are you? The message that's being received is you are not American. The Ascription of Intelligence. You are so articulate. The message here is people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites. Another example is asking a person with Asian ethnicity to help with math or science problem. The message here is all Asians are intelligent and good in math and science. There was a columnist in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and he said, well, what's wrong with that? Because the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point has something on their website about racial microaggressions and giving examples. And he's like, well, what's wrong with that? I would want to be thought of as smart and good at math. And what he was missing was the point that it wasn't that somebody thought that you were smart, but it was because based on your phenotypes or external features, there was a hidden assumption about you. Color-blindness. When I look at you, I don't see color. The message here is you deny a person of color's racial or ethnic experiences. Criminality. A store owner following a customer of color around the store. The message here is you are going to steal, or you're poor, or you don't belong here. Unfortunately, we've seen these cases in the last couple of years through Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Trayvon Martin in Florida. The denial of individual racism. I'm not a racist, I have several black friends. The message here is I'm immune to racism because I have friends of color. The myth of meritocracy. I believe the most qualified person should get the job. The message here is persons of color are given unfair benefits because of their race. Or, oh, you can get a job anywhere because you're black. The message here is persons of color are not qualified and don't have to be qualified. Everyone can succeed in this society if they just would work hard enough. The message here is people of color are lazy and are incompetent and need to work harder. Pathologizing cultural values and communication styles, such as, why are you so loud? The message here is to assimilate to the dominant culture and that no white people talk loudly. It assumes that there's no variation in voice among white people. So, is it possible that this plays out sometimes when hospital security is called. A family or visitor group is perceived as being more threatening or dangerous than white families or visitors, and healthcare staff believes that their loudness is threatening or dangerous. How about the question of, are you related? Are random groups of whites ever asked this question? Environmental microaggressions, such as a college or university with buildings that are all named after white, heterosexual, upper-class males. The message here, you don't belong. What about crayons, bandages, makeup with the label flesh tone? What color comes to mind? What do you think the message kids receive is? How about healthcare institutions' online presence or marketing materials? Consider where you might see photographs of children of color. What I've noticed in my informal research and looking around is there seems to be a tendency if there's a picture of, in pediatric institutions, a child of color, they're whitewashed. They tend to see this bright light across their face that lightens their skin. And you only see darker children on pages promoting urban or community health programs. What is the message we want to send? The power of racial microaggressions lies in their invisibility to the perpetrator and sometimes to the recipient. Most white Americans experience themselves as upstanding, moral persons who believe in equality and democracy. They find it difficult to believe that they possess biased racial attitudes and may act in a discriminatory way. So a clash of racial realities exists. Whites think minorities are doing better and do not view themselves as racist. There's this invisibility of unintentional expressions of bias, and there's also the perceived minimal harm of microaggressions. Moving on to the role of language. Everyday middle-class white discourse continues to produce and reproduce white racism. And this part on language is from Jane Hill's 2008 book, The Everyday Language of White Racism. This results in hurt and pain to individuals, glaring injustice, grossly unequal distribution of resources along racially stratified lines, and strange and damaging errors and omissions in public policy. We have this idea of standard ideology that only one way of speaking is correct. And the ways of speaking can be ranked according to their prestige. Prestigious people speak the prestigious form, which deserves its prestige because, after all, it is correct, and endowed with respectable history and a set of arguments for why it's prestigious and correct. And to speak the correct and prestigious form will bring social and economic benefits, so it's important and desirable for people to learn to speak this way. Think Pygmalion or My Fair Lady. And yet, if a speaker is stigmatized, even absolute control over a standard variety of English does not bring about social or economic benefits necessarily. Hill notes that as a linguist, I know the ideology of standard has no scientific basis. And as a reasonably observant human being, I know that many intelligent and highly moral people produce sentence fragments and spelling errors when they write. The Wall Street Journal supported this statement, noting the fluctuating nature of language in March of this year, and they suggested that struck and white be tossed out, which I was happy to hear. So how do we respond, either internally or otherwise, to our peers and colleagues or to patients and families when we hear them speak in non-standard English? Do we think, oh, they're probably not going to understand what we're telling them? Or do we question their decision-making? Moving to slurs and gaffes. They reproduce racial stigma, they protect white virtue, and they advance white privilege by denying the existence of white racism. And this we see with public figures who make a racial slur, and then they say it was a joke, or they didn't mean it, and we should all understand that they didn't mean it, they're not racist. So the excuse that some statement was a joke is always available for whites, and those who reject this excuse are seen as humorless. Yet, the idea that the plain meanings of words are suspended just because someone is joking, so that the joking intention of the speaker supersedes the meaning, conflicts with the baptismal ideology of meaning, which holds that meaning inheres in the words themselves. Personal linguistic ideology requires that to determine the true meaning of words, we must somehow have access to the speaker's heart. Linguistic appropriation is where the speakers of the target language, or the group doing the borrowing, adopts resources from the donor language, and then they try to deny these to members of the donor language community. We see this, I think, most frequently in our country with Spanish, the use of Spanish. So English speakers tend to use Spanish in a casual way, and they construct when they want to use it, and yet they're very, you see people say, well, everyone should learn to speak English. And yet a white non-Spanish speaking person may say, hey, let's go get a cerveza, or hey, amigo. So the problem here is that the person whose first language isn't Spanish is deciding how and when to use it, and they're denying its use to other people for whom it is a first language. Slang that arises out of Black American communities is the single most important source for new slang and eventually unmarked everyday colloquial usage in white American English. Yet white authorities and ordinary people scorn and abuse it in every possible way. Covert racist discourse reproduces negative stereotypes of people of color and that whites don't understand as racist. Let me give you an example. This is from 2005 from the then Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. We are moving to end the old catch and release style of border enforcement, increasing removals by tens of thousands a year. What pictures does this phrase bring to mind? Hunting? Immigrants as animals? Prey? Food? Fighting? Another example, this one from John McCain in 2007 attacking Mitt Romney. Maybe he can get out his small varmint gun and drive those Guatemalans off his yard. He was attacking Romney for employing landscape firm that had used undocumented workers from Guatemala. So some examples from the healthcare community that I've come across in the last couple of years is one was a desk staff said to a parent who was coming up to have her child seen in clinics. And she said to her, do you have your Title 19 card? And the mom said, no, I don't. And the person said, well, we can't see you if you don't have it. And the mom said, well, I don't have one. And she's like, well, you're going to have to go back and get it because we're not going to see you unless you bring it, and was getting irate. Well, the mother's aunt, who was a nurse and a PhD in theology, happened to be there with her. And she said, she has private insurance. Here's her insurance card. How about another one is the primary doctor to a nurse about a child who'd been admitted for asthma, saying, it was probably non-compliance. The nurse said, why do you say that? Here's the response, it goes with the population. So we have to pause here and talk about whiteness. Whiteness and its concomitant privileges tend to remain invisible to most white people. And yet it's impossible to understand systemic racism without naming whiteness and understanding how it works. Tim Weiss, who you've all undoubtedly heard of, defines white privilege as any advantage, opportunity, benefit, head start, or general protection from negative societal mistreatment which persons deemed white will typically enjoy, but which others will generally not enjoy. He identifies 3 types of white privilege. Material, where myself, I would have a greater opportunity in the labor market or a greater net worth due to my history or my family's history where they were allowed to accumulate wealth and pass it along to me. Social, I'm presumed to be competent and law-abiding and to have credit. When I use my credit card, it's assumed that it's mine. Psychological, I don't have to worry when I go out about triggering a negative stereotype. I rarely feel out of place, and I don't have to worry when I drive about racial profiling. Peggy McIntosh writes on the meaning of white privilege, and she names 2 out of several pages, that she writes, if I need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing a house in an area that I can afford to live in and which I'd want to live in. Further, I can be pretty sure my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. So where's the harm in all this? So harm occurs when race is used as a proxy for characteristics typically ascribed to members of a group. And yet we know race is not useful in knowing a patient, understanding a disease, or creating a treatment plan. Race is mentioned more often during presentations on patients of color. Accumulated microaggressions from daily life may result in increased cortisol. Microaggressions contribute to stress for the target person, which may partly account for some of the racial health disparities. Experiences of discrimination and racism leads to chronic stress, resulting again in increased levels of cortisol. Childhood stress has a direct effect on poor health later in life. Experiences of prolonged, frequent adversity without adult support can result in prolonged or toxic stress response, and we know that this disrupts the brain's architecture and increases the person for stress-related diseases and cognitive impairment. Perceived discrimination is associated with lower levels of satisfaction with the healthcare system. Persons of color who perceive disrespect or discrimination because of their race were less likely to get an annual physical exam, receive appropriate preventative care for heart disease, hypertension, or diabetes, or to follow doctor's advice. Racism is a toxic stressor. It results in an allostatic load. It contributes to the occurrence of chronic diseases and conditions. Perceived racism is associated with depression, anxiety, poor self-esteem, conduct problems, anger, drug and alcohol abuse and abuse. This harm could result in part from a phenomenon called internalized racial oppression, and that's where the person internalizes the negative perceptions of one's race held by the dominant race or culture. I should have Holly Tabor talk more about this. Telomeres. So what are they? As I understand it, they're DNA-based caps and protein structures on the tip of a chromosome, and their length may serve as an early predictor of disease onset and early mortality. So childhood stress and trauma tends to erode or shorten the telomere length and thus shorten someone's lifespan. And the trauma doesn't have to be physical trauma. It can be emotional trauma or small little microaggressions, daily traumas. Du Bois wrote in The Souls of Black Folk about a phenomenon called the veil. And he says that this veil stands between Black Americans and white America. It inhibits access for non-whites to privileges reserved for white Americans, and it prevents the ability to see problems of race for white Americans. There's a sense and knowledge of this veil of one's own individual identity and also how I'm going to be read through a racial lens. He talks about beyond the veil, where there's no racial constraints on one's life and the ability to make choices. Janice has talked about some of the disparities that arise from this. The interventions aiming to eliminate discrimination might have benefits for ameliorating a wider range of health problems than initially supposed, not just mental health. The reasons for addressing the causes of discrimination are not limited towards resolving societal and economic injustice, but as part of a multidimensional strategy towards tackling health inequities across the life course. This is from a law journal. We do not believe that covert and the automatic nature of implicit racial biases, in light of persisting societal harms, absolve society of the responsibility for their harm. Professionals have been reluctant to believe that their own behaviors, those of their peers, and the policies of their institutions may often go against their professional oaths and principles. So what are some strategies? I had the privilege of talking to Dr. White last summer about his work at Harvard and his book, which I highly recommend, Seeing Patients' Unconscious Bias in Healthcare. And he had established a culturally competent care committee where he advocated for teaching cultural competence as you would require a student to take physiology. He used his own committee funds to support a self-awareness course, and he advocated that all educated persons should be educated to be culturally literate. He wrote that physicians bear a special humanistic and egalitarian obligation to look at this and to do this work. All right. We know that police forces are looking at implicit bias, and moving on to medical schools, what's being done. I had the opportunity to participate in a course called Unlearning Racism, and that was a pilot program at the Medical College of Wisconsin. It was open to faculty and staff, and we had a 24-person cohort. We met in 4-hour sessions over 6 weeks. We looked at films, dialogued, and had reflection time. Another course is offered at Harvard. It's Healing Healthcare Disparities Through Education. It's interdisciplinary. There's interactive methods to achieve mandated LCME, mandated integration of cross-cultural care into preclinical and clinical years of medical school and residency program. For the first time this year, Sherry Johnson and Linda Moyer ran in their urban community pathway session, managing implicit bias in healthcare delivery. And that was a 3-hour session for M2s and M3s, and we included a didactic about healthcare inequalities, the role of implicit bias, a moderated panel discussion, and then we introduced them to some mindfulness practices. There's also some talk at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, where I'm co-chair of their ethics committee, on looking at implicit bias through the sanctuary model, which is trauma-informed care, and seeing if there's a way we can introduce at least some groundwork for examining where we're at. Milwaukee is the most racially segregated city in the nation. Lukey and Gibson did some work, and they found that mindfulness was effective in addressing this. Brief mindfulness meditation reduced implicit race and age bias. Participants listened to a 10-minute audio tape not related to, I don't know what I'm doing, sorry everyone. Maybe you want to look at the pretty pictures. They listened to an audio tape that was not related to race or bias, and it made participants more aware of their own sensations and thoughts in a non-judgmental way. Mindfulness meditation focuses the individual on the present and encourages practitioners to view thoughts and feelings non-judgmentally as mental events rather than as part of the self. There was one study that said if the more conscious you are of being biased and not wanting to act in that way, the more you actually did act in that way. So I know. So then Devine and all, they had an intervention based on the premise that implicit bias is a habit that could be broken by a combination of awareness, concern, and applying strategies. And they found that people who were concerned about discrimination or reported using strategies showed the greatest reduction in implicit race bias.